Okay, so in terms of the material here, you have that. If you have a copy of that, great. If you had a chance to look it over, perfect. We're not going to go in detail specifically over a lot of the points in that material tonight. Certainly feel free to leverage that. If you have questions about that, any particular item we can discuss. But a lot of that is just sort of some good information, good outline. And the way I think Jeff and I were talking, the way we want to approach maybe going through this is we use the analogy of like when you meet somebody, okay? And if you introduce yourself to somebody, it's pretty normal, okay? Extend your hand, shake, hi, what's your name? What's like a next question you might ask somebody? Where are you from? What do you do? Natural things like that, like, facts, information, right? You get details. And that's where all relationship starts. And that's really where every piece of learning you ever do starts, is at the very introductory fact level, right? The grammar, as you might call it in a trivium, a classical education. But where does it go from there, right? You learn facts, and then you start understanding sort of meaning behind it. You start understanding interconnected relationships, right? So now all of a sudden you start getting a sense of, okay, so I know that you do this. Well, the fact that you do this for a living or might say something about you, or you might think a certain way. Sometimes people will talk to me and they're like, I could tell you have some sort of engineering background because you use terms like friction and, this kind of stuff. You can get a sense of people, what their background is, by the kinds of language they use. And so you get a sense of that. And so that, just as you learn them, you get to know more about them. And eventually you get to the point where you feel comfortable introducing that person to somebody. Hey, I'd like for you to meet Jim, right? I'd like for you to meet Carl. Hey, here's Kathy. And you might even choose who you introduce them to because you know something about both of them. And so you can now actually advocate and say, hey, I think you'd hit it off with so-and-so. And so what we want to do is try to come into the class each session. Let's get as far past the handshake as we can, right? Now let's having read the passage, there's on average, it's only going to be less than 2 chapters sort of per lesson. And the questions in each of these are pretty straightforward. It's very much guided. Some of them are a little open-ended, but for a lot of them, it's like, okay, what happened? What went on here? Let's just get through that so we can come in having that base ground understanding. So we can try to look at John and say, okay, what is he drawing on from the Old Testament, and try to draw out some of those allusions and references, things like that, over the course of this study. So any questions on that? Good, because I was moving on. Okay, so we just want to take a few minutes and go through this presentation. By a few, I mean most of the class. But I'll set this over here. This is not comedy hour, but okay, so I'm just going to kick it off with this question. What is a gospel? I'm choosing that article carefully. What is a gospel? Or what does the word gospel mean in our lingo, vernacular? What do you guys think?
Message.
A message, good. What else?
Good news.
Good news, yes. Anything else?
Disciple. Being a disciple.
Being a disciple, okay, yeah. Fulfilling the gospel.
It's kind of a story.
A story, yeah.
Truth.
Truth, yeah. So you got allusions like gospel truth, this sort of stuff, yeah.
Announcement.
An announcement, that's a good word, okay. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, this next slide, I think a couple years ago we were looking at, Luke, we talked about this a little bit too, or some of these ideas. But gospel is an English translation of the Greek word for, pronounce that, evangelion, okay, which means news that brings great joy, okay? And, of course, we hear gospel today, and unfortunately, the more comfortable the world gets with this concept, it means less and less, specifically to Christianity, of course. But originally, it actually wasn't even an innately spiritual word. It was really a political kind of message that would happen, okay? And there's a few examples of this that they may have used this term. Like, for example, anybody heard of the Battle of Marathon, right? So anybody know how that 26.2 mile thing happened?
Distance from the battle back to Rome.
Yeah, and so what was that person running? What was the mission that person was on? Right, he wanted to bring back victory, because the sooner I can get that message to you, the more you can change your battle plans or whatever. Okay, so that's an example of a good message that was sent out, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, while there weren't like formally heralds or things like this that sent out, but that was a news of victory, if you will. And so that was disseminated, of course, throughout. It was a message of good news that would happen. But in the most sort of formal, traditional sense, this idea of the gospel of Caesar Augustus, okay, this was a thing. So an inscription found in Priene in modern-day Turkey referring to Caesar Augustus says, "The birthday of Augustus has been for the whole world the beginning of the gospel concerning him." And so one of the things that would happen is, if you're a military leader or senator or commander, you're heading into a city, right, and you want to announce that you're coming or that you're coming back, you're going to read a list of your accomplishments, read the victory that you've created, and sort of implied in that is that you want to be prepared to receive this person who's coming. Okay, so that's part of what's going on, with the gospel. And kind of note that word birthday there, because that's sort of an important thing as part of this. But there's also this inscription that we have found in 6 BC, and we'll read it like this: "The most divine Caesar," right? This is sort of part of his gospel. We see the last slide. The birthday has been for the beginning of the gospel, and so this is elaborating on what this gospel is of Caesar here. "The most divine Caesar we should consider equal to the beginning of all things. For when everything was falling into disorder and tending toward dissolution, he restored it once more and gave the whole world a new aura. Caesar, the common good fortune of all, the beginning of life and vitality. All the cities unanimously adopt the birthday of the divine Caesar as the new beginning of the year." Like, this is shifting the calendar, right? "Whereas the providence which has regulated our whole existence has brought our life to the climax of perfection, and giving to us the Emperor Augustus, who being sent to us and our descendants as Savior, has put an end to war and has set all things in order. And whereas, having become God manifest, Caesar has fulfilled all the hopes of earlier times." You get this sense of like the drama, the flair, the accomplishment that has happened here. And so we would use this in our sort of common term, this idea of Pax Romana. Have you heard that term? Roman peace. Okay. So what was his big accomplishment? There's lots of fighting between the Greeks and between the Romans and all these skirmishes. And so what did he achieve? He wanted to achieve peace. Well, we're familiar with what's going on in New Testament times. And how was that peace accomplished or achieved or maintained?
By force.
By force. Yes, very good. By brutality. By walking around and everyone being super familiar with crucifixion and saying, "Don't cause trouble because you're next," right? So this illusion of sort of peace was through force and through fear, right? Particularly that of death, not only by the common citizen, but by the non-citizens and also by the military leaders who were like, "Hey, you're going to fall in line with that." And so this idea of that a gospel is it political? What do you think? Is a gospel political based off kind of what we saw there?
In this case, yes.
In this case, yes. Just in this case? Okay. Maybe so, maybe not. Well, let's look at this next thing here. So is the gospel political? What do we see throughout the Gospels? We see this association of what? They're going throughout proclaiming the gospel and teaching it. And what's the constant criticism? What is the point of contention that they bring up and raise to those in power and authorities? What are some of the themes we see in these verses here?
They're follow the old law, keep the old law.
Not so much with the Jewish leaders, yes, but with the sort of Rome.
Okay, I got you.
What were the themes of contention that were brought up there?
He's saying he's king.
He's saying he's king. So throughout we see this, like, what is their primary source of attack? I mean, ultimately, this is going to culminate. It's not even something that they buy into. The Romans, as I understand, didn't like the word king, okay, in the first place. They used words like emperor, because kings are what they defeated. But we see here, accuse him. We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. So you kind of get the sense that they're defining what the word Christ means here, right? That's not exactly this idea of anointed is not necessarily something the Romans would have been using to describe an emperor or leader like that. But this was their primary course of attack. So implicit in that is, how are they going to make this attack true or false in terms of him trying to establish an earthly kingdom? There's a reason that's a refrain throughout the Gospels. My kingdom is what? Not this world. Why does he have to say that? Because the message, essentially, of the gospel is one that feels and seems very much like a military victory, right? He's described in these terms, right? In Acts 7, and Jason has received them, Acts 17, and they are all acting against the decree of Caesar, saying that there's another king. And this kind of charge sticks. Yeah, Jeff.
And one of the things too is they were kind of expecting a king to come back. So like that's what they've been looking for. Of course, they were thinking a normal earthly king like David, because it's got to be better than David, and David was good.
Yes.
So look at all the victories he had.
Lots of
That's what we're
victories.
expecting here.
Yeah.
So I think it has a play on it as well.
And especially even in Mark's gospel, it sort of just comes out swinging, this idea that he is leading this sort of military campaign, if you will, of we talk about how he's baptized in the Jordan, parallels with Joshua crossing the Jordan. John doesn't talk a lot about casting out demons, but it's a strong emphasis right at the beginning of Mark. He's coming on a military campaign to reclaim territory, right? So that's a theme definitely throughout. Yeah, Aaron.
Well, and that, as Jeff pointed out, about the Jewish expectation, what we've learned through some of this history too is that the Romans were aware of the Jewish expectation. It wasn't just that the Jews thought this privately and expected it. And so if a Roman would ask a Jew and a Jewish person felt comfortable answering it without any kind of reprisal, he would say, yeah, we have a king coming back, we're going to take you down.
Yeah.
And so they knew from the beginning, the way they viewed it was, there will come a time when they're going to raise this guy, whoever it is, and he's going to be in direct competition to Rome. And so, Jesus is having a hard time convincing his own followers. No, that's not what I came to do. So, you can see here in Matthew 2, that's what he took it. And he was also, he's morphed his life between being a Jew and having close ties to Rome. He took it that way,
Mm-hmm.
So, that I like how you respond to that, because it really goes to show how, because it's lost on us in the 21st century, think what the threat that would have been to them. So from the moment he was announced, his life was in danger. The moment he was announced, it was a powder keg.
Oh yeah, and you see it right in the beginning of how the gospel's treated. And we have to keep in mind, a lot of this stuff was circulating orally, right? Verbally, as stories telling it, going out and preaching. So, when Paul went around, he wasn't cracking open John or Matthew and reading it, right? That's not how they were doing it. Like, for example, Mark's gospel, pretty clear that he was sort of understudy of Peter. And a lot of what was being written down was Peter's sermons and preaching and the stuff that he's telling. So that kind of takes on a different feel of those synoptic gospels, right? But absolutely, it's built right into the beginning of the way it's framed once it's written down for us to have. Thanks for sharing that. And so we're going to take just a quick second look. After having discussed some of that, just underlining some of those key things. You see these themes in here. And so there's a lot of overlap. So just by calling it a gospel in and of itself, just calling it a gospel is saying something. right? So if they're using the term, this is a gospel, it is implying a sort of political aspect. And again, lots of clarification about what kind of politic it is, right? What kind of citizenry and kingdom. But that's built into that. And so we see, look at these themes. I mean, beginning of life, resetting the calendar. This is the first day. I think with Jesus, it reshaped BC and AD, right? A savior, set things in order, become God, fulfills hopes. And so there's a lot of themes going on here with, okay, a victory. There's a victory that's happening here. And of course, we know that victory was of a similar but very surpassing nature. So any thoughts or questions at this point? So, what is the gospel of Christ? So, kind of some of the things we touched on here. Mark 1:1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Okay, so if you now know that here's this inscription describing the gospel of Caesar, and that's a thing, and you've heard military leaders come into your town, or senators come into your town, and they're reading stuff like this, and then somebody says, I'm going to read from you this testimony by this guy named Mark, okay? And it says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, right? Yeah.
I guess in our day and time, I guess it's beyond the blog status now, but, kind of where, you chronicle everything that happened, in somebody's life, much like it happened in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings, right? Everything that they did, and, you would see them going back and rereading that. So now you're seeing, okay, here's the Chronicles of another king that was born.
That's right. That's right. And from the outset, right, it's called that. This is what we're dealing with in the Son of God. And just Luke 9:6, and they departed and went through the villages preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. So what's interesting is even early on, we see this term that they are preaching the gospel. But wait a minute, this is kind of early and in the narrative, right? So what are they preaching? What is the gospel that is actually being preached here? We think about the gospel on this side of it, but they're preaching the gospel throughout his ministry. So let's explore this a little more. What then is the gospel that was being taught? Because we think a lot about, spreading the gospel, and we kind of have a sense of what that is in culmination today. And in Acts, they're out proclaiming the gospel. But Jesus himself is going around proclaiming the gospel. So let's just dig into that a little bit, right? So what is it? Any thoughts on what the gospel is?
He was highly anticipated in the Old Testament, right? Mm-hmm. You go back through and you look at all the prophecies that were concerning this Messiah that was to come. And now they're proclaiming that, hey, look at what this man, if you will, is doing. He's starting to fulfill things that were spoken of this one who was to come. Mm-hmm. He can heal the sick. He can raise the dead. That's already starting to happen during, this time.
That's really good. There's two main things there. And we're going to see that. We're going to dive head first. No. Next week, so the prologue of John's gospel, we're going to explore that a lot. That whole idea of, okay, two things. Who is he? Why does he have authority? And then what is this victory, right? What is the victory of life ultimately, right? And so turn in your Bibles to Luke chapter 20. That's right, Luke, you heard me say it. Okay? Luke chapter 20. And this is I thought this was actually really useful, hence why it's on the screen. But I just kind of was looking at Luke, and I said, you know what, Luke here, if you think about what the gospel is, and we kind of will drill into that a little bit. Luke almost in this chapter walks us through it doesn't come out and say, step 1, gospel, step 2, gospel. But based off the instruction, the teaching, and the feedback, and what the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers are coming to him and arguing with him about, that sort of tells you what this preaching was saying, right? So, part 1, we won't read the whole thing. But somebody read verses 1 and 2.
One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. Tell us by what authority you are doing this. They said, who gave you this authority?
Okay, thank you, Ralph. So he's teaching and he's preaching the gospel. Well, what's he saying? I don't know what he's saying. But do we know what he's saying? What's the response to what he's saying? They come up and ask him what, John?
Yeah, whose authority?
Whose authority? So he's teaching. This is a big shift. This is maybe revealed teaching that he's saying, I'm coming with authority. Well, whose authority ultimately are you bringing as part of this? Okay? So the gospel is connected to authority from God. Do you have a question or thought? Okay.
So I was just thinking, obviously, Jesus is like, hey, we're restoring this relationship here. Like, when we're thinking of the terms of gospel before it actually happened, we know it's good news. It's about Jesus, being the man of God, or he is God. And he's here on earth, and he's going to save us. And he does, because he's resurrected. And that's the good news for us, because now we have this ultimate chance to not just, once we're dead, that's not it. There's more. There's more for us to do with him. But we also have this idea of, as he's saying it, it's like this restoration is beginning now.
Mm-hmm.
And because it is kind of an interesting thing to think about. It's the things that he's accomplished, as the word gospel is, in the past, but as from now on, it's like, from there on, it's right there.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, I'm here. This is it. This is the time.
It's what he has accomplished already. He's showing his authority by what he's doing. But then also is, okay, by having accomplished this, I deserve honor, respect, or in our case, much greater than that, worship. But yes, it's what he has accomplished and what he's accomplishing. And what does that mean for you? So let's keep walking through this. Good. Yes, sir.
Maybe a good tie into that is what he says in Matthew 5:17 and 18. You don't think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy but fulfill. And he says, for surely I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. So everything about the law, I think we mention it fairly frequently. Like in Acts 8, when Philip preached Jesus from the Old Testament, and Paul would preach Jesus from the scrolls or something. He is the fulfillment of those things. And that time that has been talked about, going back to Nelson's point, this seems to be kind of a landmark thing he's saying here, right here at the early one of the Sermon on the Mount. That this big thing that you've been hearing about is happening now. Saturday when he was talking about that, made me think of Matthew 5.
Yeah, my Father has been working and is working to this day, right? And he is working also. Yes, this is an ongoing thing, and he's bringing to fullness an overflowingness, right, of everything talked about, right, in the Old Testament. And we won't read all this part 2 here, but he tells this parable, right, about a man who planted the vineyard goes off and he sends a couple of servants and they reject him. And then finally he sends his son, right? And this is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours. Verse 17, but he looked directly at them and said, what then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Cornerstone, very critical. This is where everything else is tied to. And so this is the beginning. So what, again, he's talking about the role. He's talking about inheritance. He's talking about he's the firstborn among many brethren. Through everything will be extended through him. So we see this idea. This next part 3. And so clearly inflammatory, right? They perceive that he told this parable against them. So innately, this language, they can see immediately that we can pit him up against Rome. This is a sort of a political message. There's elements of kingship. There's elements of authority. He's coming in It's like, wait a minute, if nothing else, Rome has subjugated us, and so he wants to come in, if nothing else, the new leader of this people, and well, that's political turmoil at minimum, but at maximum, it's like trying to mess with Rome. So, okay, how do we start this whole pitting against the two? And so this parable ultimately speaks to what? People bearing the image of God, that God is the anything that's descendant from God, anything bearing God's image, God is therefore has a greater authority over. Okay? And so even Caesar, right, he does it in the most PC way possible, right? Even Caesar bears the image of God, and therefore God has authority over Caesar. Okay, and so sure, give to Caesar what's Caesar, give to God what's God's, including the money, including Caesar himself, including you yourself, because you bear the image of God, so you belong to him just as much. So appealing to this authority. So you can already see he's trying to build off this idea. So you get a sense based off their challenges what kind of message he's been giving, right? Any thoughts or comments on that? Part 4, okay. Okay, and so then, okay, what's the next thing sort of telegraphed for us? What is the next challenge, right? Because the arguments they come to him with are going to be in response to the teaching that he's giving, right? So part 4, who comes? The Sadducees, those who deny there's a resurrection. Okay, you can you can see hints, and Jesus is going to talk about this here. The Sadducees, as I understand it, really didn't, they kind of only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible. They really didn't look at any of the prophets or things like that, which you get a little more detail into the idea of a resurrection. And so I think part of what his response to that is, so they started attacking, well, this lady had a bunch of husbands or wives, or she didn't have wives. But, and so in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be? So they're hearing a message about resurrection, about life. And so they're like, well, let's start picking holes in this. So that's part of the message that he's teaching, this idea of a resurrection. So they're bringing that to him. And we see that later on with Mary and Martha, right, with Lazarus. Oh, we know. Yeah, we got it. He's going to be raised in the life to come in the resurrection. So they're being taught this, right? That's part of what they're teaching, part of what he's teaching. And so they're coming to him and fighting against that. And part of what he says is, but that the dead are raised, even Moses showed in the passage about the bush where he calls the Lord the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now he is not God of the dead, but of the living, for all live to him. And so part of the response is, okay, Sadducees, you want to talk Pentateuch? Okay, you want to talk the first 5 books? All right, let's go back to Genesis. Okay? Let's go back there. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. He's the God of them now. They're not dead. They're not done. Right? So I think that's part of what the resurrection message is a key part of what he's teaching. And then part 5, and so then you get into this whole thing about David, and traditionally the father has higher authority than the son, right? So it's like, well, then how does David call his son his Lord? How is David's son going to be greater than he, right? So, well, I was before. He was before David, okay? So that's how. And then this idea of making... I make your enemies your footstool. Again, victory language over enemies, both then and now, right? So conquering this idea of foes, that's the victory. So we have the resurrection part, that's what? Conquering death. We have the enemies part, conquering foes, right? Making them his footstool, okay? So that's part of this victory language that we have here. And this last part, not to be ignored, is this idea of how he finishes this out. And he makes it clear. And in the hearing of all the people, he said to them, I don't want anybody to miss this, okay? Beware of those in authority. because they devour widows' houses, they make long prayers, they will receive a greater condemnation. Okay, so what's coming? There's a judgment coming, right? And so this is all part. I love this Luke 20 because it sort of says, here's all the counter arguments, here's all the reply guys, here's all the things coming back at him, trying to counter what he's teaching. And so he's just dealing with it, handling it. Okay, any questions or comments at that point? And so just in summary, we got this, the gospel of Christ. This is what he's teaching. Coming with authority, the Son of God implies inheritance. Okay, he's authority greater than kings of the world, everything. He's bringing the message of resurrection, which is conquering of death, destruction, God of the living, not of the dead. He's conquering his enemies. We see that not so much in John, but the casting out of demons. So both earthly and other princes and principalities of the air, this kind of idea. He's defeated and conquered them even. And this final ordering. Similar theme we saw in this Gospel of Caesar. Like he brought to order and chaos. That's what he's doing. He's putting things back in order for both our lives and really the world all over. So, any questions, comments about the gospel of Christ? No? Okay. So then ask this question. If there's one gospel, that's it, then why are there 4 gospels? Why are there 4 books? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What's going on? Because Luke, he sort of mentions this. And verse 1, and as much as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. So lots of attempts. People were doing this. Holy Spirit has seemed it fit to preserve these 4 for us. Okay, so we've got these 4. But what does this tell us that there's 4? Why are there 4? What's going on? What do you think?
Different audiences.
Yeah, good. Different audiences. And so you're going to craft it, right? There's some Bible classes going on in the building. And if we all decided we had VBS, and to some extent we were trying to teach them all similar stuff, but the class, even though it was the same Hezekiah or the same Solomon we're teaching, it wasn't presented out the same way to every audience, right? Because different levels of understanding, different perspectives, etc. Right? Good. What else?
So it jives with the old law, actually, when it says you don't receive an accusation against someone without the witness, 2 or 3 witnesses. And this is an accusation that's, upholding a truth, but there's 2, 3, 4 witnesses in this case.
That's great. Yeah, great point. 2 or 3 witnesses, and of course, then you have Luke writing lots of eyewitnesses. He's recording. He takes a different style, sort of a history eyewitness approach. We got John, who's eyewitness directly himself. Matthew, of course, and then Mark, as we talked about, sort of recording some of the things that Peter was probably teaching. So, other thoughts? Why 4? Yeah, Dale.
To get a complete picture. So we have EPA come in and they do sanitary surveys. And one of them will come here one time and will pick on one thing, and the next person will come in there. He won't say anything about that, but he'll pick on this part over here. So each pick on it. So, the same way the Gospels, you've got different teachers with different teaching styles. And when you look at them, you get a complete picture of.
Yeah, great point. You think about some of the key figures in history, and some of these people have had a bazillion books written about them, okay? Some of them are going to focus on this part of their life, this early life, what they did here, what their profession was, where they fished in retirement, all this stuff, right? But different perspective, different angles. What are they trying to focus on? Same thing, I heard this analogy of a 3D object, right? We can argue, is the earth round, is it flat? I don't know, it's all perspective, right? Now, but the idea is your angle, how you see it, presents a different picture. And I'm thinking Michaela with Dale's story. It's like, I'm sure some health inspectors walking in there, they've got a pet peeve about those food scissors and how you handle those. I have no idea. I'm just making this up. My wife has a pet peeve about food scissors, so I'm surely Michaela does. Anyway, so different perspectives, right? Different ideas going on here. And some of them have different time periods, right? The earliest one, as far as we can tell, is Mark, written sort of before the destruction of the temple. And then you got John, we're studying here, written probably in the 90s. So there's a lot of evidence that John had access probably to all of these. And so if he's going to write something different, he's going to focus on some different ideas. Yeah, Jeff.
And having four builds the case for Christ. You know, if they all said the exact same thing, then they're all probably conspired against whatever the topic is. It's probably lying, right? In a court case.
Right.
So when you have a little bit of this different testimonies, but still kind of coming to the same conclusion, then you know that they were there.
Yeah, and Christy, I'm sure if like you get 4 papers and they're like totally the same, you're like, wow, amazing.
That's never happened.
How did that happen? I mean, they must have all been listening to the same lecture. Yeah, John.
Well, and also, right there, it says many have undertaken. So, right then, even the 4 that we have preserved for us, in that first century, they could be checked with other people.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't like, where'd you come up with this, Luke? John, where'd you hear this? There was lots of other people that are doing the same stories and the same ideas, and they could verify it. So it just shows the authenticity of it.
It absolutely shows authenticity, and we take for granted a very literate culture. I mean, this was not a literate culture. The masses did not read, they did not write, and so an oral history, hearing, telling stories was a much bigger part of what they did than what we do now. Okay, so that's an important aspect of this too. Let's see. So there's some things that are uniqueness. I mean, things that are not in John. Like there's not really much of a birth narrative in here. We'll see next week how it's like, okay, I think it's Luke's gospel says all the way up to genealogy and end, son of Adam, son of God. Okay, so he makes that case pretty clear. But John takes a different approach to that. Some of these other things, temptation of Jesus, casting out demons, institution formally of the Lord's Supper, we don't see. The transfiguration itself is not really listed there. But the elements of these things are all there. So that also tells that sort of connecting those dots. John has access to these other ones. Okay, how can I share a different perspective? So we see the institution of the Lord's Supper, but John chapter 6 seemingly touches on some of the theology of why having the Lord's Supper is good. What is that doing? How does that work? A little more than just, I'm not trying to downplay the mechanics of what's going on in the memorial, but let's talk more about what's going on behind the scenes. Okay. And then vice versa, we have uniqueness of things in John, right, that were not necessarily in other ones. This prologue concept, very different. I love it. It's beautiful. All of next lesson is all about that. Of course, we have the I am statements. The water into wine is unique to that. Some of the conversations with Nicodemus, woman at the well, the long sort of farewell discourse that he does, beautiful prayer. We talked about some of these other things. The idea even of a 3-year ministry. If you read the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as they're called, it's kind of hard to get a picture actually of a multi-year story. It's sort of like, this happened, and then they ended up right here, right? Because they're telling the story in a particular way to try to communicate a certain thing. And so we see multiple references of Passover and other feasts in John, so that kind of gives us a sense of the raising of Lazarus is a key detail that sort of tells us, you kind of see in the other Gospels, like why all of a sudden this teaching is going in and all of a sudden they're laying down palm branches for him. Well, he conquered death. Like Lazarus was raised from the dead, like a key detail. And so that helps us build a fuller picture of why these things happened when they did. And then a lot of more post-resurrection detail. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I think it's interesting, when you do look at John, like you said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even though, Mark's is abbreviated, he's very concise with his writing, whereas Luke, a physician, wrote more detail. They're covering more of his entire life from birth to death, versus John, who picks, very important pieces of his life and really focuses on the aspects around those. It doesn't deal with any of this is what Jews do necessarily, but, and why, but it details the things, that are necessary for our conversion.
Right. It's kind of like when you have an inside joke with somebody and you can just say 3 words and everyone's laughing. It's like, okay, what's going on here? Well, if you know all the backstory, so if you've got all Matthew, Mark, and Luke going on, and then he can, like, he's filling in details. It's almost like, oh, he's connecting a dot that maybe wasn't there before, right? Somewhere, Christy's thinking about a couple inside jokes over there, it looks like. No. And so just a few minutes left, but John sort of takes on of a witness. So, right, we see throughout this here, right there in the prologue, we have seen his glory. He's saying, I was there. We also see in John chapter 19, but one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. He's there. He is observing these things. We also have this John the loved, right? He's one of these. He refers to himself, looks like in John, as the one whom Jesus loved. It's sort of like the opposite sense of humility that happens in Mark. So he doesn't name himself really in it, but he talks about how he's there. A sort of a beautiful thing, and maybe one or two other things there. But then you also have, like, for example, in Mark, it seems a lot of the negative things about Peter. So if Peter, we get the sense that he's sort of repentant, so he's telling lots of stories about how messed up he was in the early days. You kind of get that sense of a lot of that is he beats up himself a lot in Mark. It's the idea that he's showing the humble side of him. So I'm going to talk about myself, but all the terrible things I was doing, Whereas John, maybe just I'm going to leave myself out because I maybe didn't have as many terrible things, right? And then also of the three, right? A few key things here: the transfiguration, the garden at Gethsemane, healing of Jairus' daughter, right? Those are the three things where Peter, James, and John are there, and seemingly nobody else, right? So he's one of these three. And then really this last thing, it's like just this point about why is it important to study the Gospels? Last thing. Versus, say, other stuff in the New Testament.
It tells the story of Jesus as being our Savior.
Yeah. Amen. Right? This is the story. This is the victory. And everything else is branching off of that, right? What is it that, Acts is recording? How they disseminated, how they preached the gospel. What are the epistles to that Paul writes? The people trying to live out this gospel, now have a hope, an expectation of newness, of life in a community. This is how you do that, right? You Thessalonians, you have a lot of these questions about the next life and the second coming, and did I miss it? And it's like, yeah, they're in it to win it, but they have all these questions now. So let's try to clean up a little bit, right? So the gospel is our story, right? It is what we're trying to understand and know. That is the victory that Christ has given us. And so it starts there. And we should study a lot. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about at this point with Matthew 5, particularly Matthew 5, in the first chapter of 3 in the Sermon on the Mount. You heard that it was said to those of old, but I say unto you. And there seems to be, by the time of the Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees of Jesus' day, they've missed the point. They've missed the love behind the command, and even if they did teach the command, they did it in a way that was lacking what God's true purpose was for it. And we could do that today, fast forward to our time. If we're going to disregard or you're flipping about the Gospels, we can go to all those other commands that Paul writes about and try to enforce things and miss the point because this is the foundation of the point right here. And so a good way to avoid a Matthew 5, rebuke for us would be to make sure we firmly understand the Gospels in its entirety, not just John, but especially as we're getting into this one here. That will certainly help us to understand God's true motive behind the commands as they're given later in this epistle.
Yeah. Well put, for sure, because this is the culmination of everything that was going on back then. And if we try to substitute the gospel as more, or I should say less about the things he's accomplished and the things he's accomplishing, and more about a new set of rules or things like that, we're going to miss what he's done and why he's doing it and what we're we're called to be a part of. So thanks for the class. Yes, Court, go ahead.
And it also has all the red words though.
Hey, it's got all the red words. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Just cut to the chase, right?
Red words. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the rest of the class.